Now, there's different kinds of courage in this world. There's the courage to face down a grizzly with nothing but a hunting knife, and there's the courage to love someone when the whole town's watching and waiting for you to fail. I've seen both kinds, and I'll tell you straight, the second one's harder by a country mile. This here's a story about what happens when a woman tries to outrun her past but can't escape her present, and how sometimes it takes a man with more backbone than brains to remind a whole town what Christian charity really looks like. It's about the difference between being judged by what you've done and being loved for who you are underneath it all. So pull your chair closer to the fire, friend. The wind's picking up outside, and what I'm about to tell you happened when Redemption wore work clothes and spoke in a voice that wouldn't take no for an answer. Rose McCready had been trying to leave Timber Ridge for 3 months, but shame has a way of following a person like a shadow at high noon. She stood at the window of her small room above Henderson's Mercantile, watching the morning bustle on Main Street and counting the coins she'd saved from her work at the Silver Dollar Saloon, work that had branded her in the eyes of decent folks as something less than respectable. Rose wasn't much past 25, with auburn hair that caught the light like copper wire and green eyes that held more intelligence than most men in Timber Ridge were comfortable acknowledging. She'd come west 3 years ago with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart full of hope, fleeing a marriage back in Missouri that had nearly killed her in ways that didn't leave bruises you could see. The Silver Dollar wasn't the kind of establishment where a woman went to preserve her reputation. Rose served drinks, sang for the crowd, and danced with miners and cowboys who had more money than manners. She kept her hands to herself and her business private, but in a town like Timber Ridge, working in a saloon was enough to mark a woman as fallen, regardless of what she actually did or didn't do behind closed doors. "Morning, Rose," called out Mrs. Patterson from across the street, her voice dripping with the kind of false sweetness that preceded the sharpest cuts. "Still planning to inflict yourself on some other poor town?" Rose lifted her chin and managed a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good morning, Mrs. Patterson. I trust you slept well." The older woman sniffed like she'd smelled something unpleasant. "Well enough, though. Decent folks do worry about the influence of certain elements on our community's moral fiber." It was the same dance they'd been doing for weeks now. Rose would announce her intentions to leave. The townspeople would make it clear she wasn't welcome to stay, but somehow the money for a proper steak always seemed just out of reach. Train tickets cost dear, and starting over in a new place required funds she didn't have. Standing outside the feed store, pretending to examine a saddle, but actually watching this exchange with the kind of attention most men reserved for poker hands, was Daniel Crawford. Dan was a rancher who ran cattle on a spread about 10 miles north of town, not the biggest operation in the territory, but respectable enough. He was 34 years old, built like a man who'd spent his life working with his hands, with brown hair and eyes the color of strong coffee. Dan had been watching Rose McCready for the better part of a year now, not in any improper way, but with the kind of interest a man develops when he sees something fine being treated poorly. He'd noticed how she carried herself with dignity, despite the whispers that followed her down every street. He'd seen how she was kind to children, even when their mothers pulled them away from her path. He'd watched her tend to old Charlie Hennessy when he was too drunk to make it home, getting him safely to his boarding house without taking advantage or asking for anything in return. Most importantly, Dan Crawford had been raised by a mother who'd taught him to judge people by their actions rather than their circumstances, and by his observation, Rose McCready's actions spoke of a woman with more character than half the so-called respectable folks in Timber Ridge. The problem was, Dan had never been much good with words. He could gentle a spooked horse and read weather signs like a book, but talking to women, especially women who'd been hurt the way Rose clearly had, was territory he'd never learned to navigate. That afternoon, Rose made her regular trip to the general store for supplies. She needed thread for mending and a few groceries to last her through the week. Simple enough, except that Mrs. Henderson, the store owner's wife, had made it her personal mission to remind Rose of her place in the town's social order every chance she got. "I suppose you'll be wanting to put this on credit again," Mrs. Henderson said loud enough for the other customers to hear, her voice carrying the implication that Rose's money was somehow tainted by its source. "No, ma'am," Rose replied quietly, counting out exact change from her small purse. "I pay as I go." "Well, I should hope so. Though I suppose we all know where that money comes from, don't we?" The woman's laugh was sharp as broken glass. Rose felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "It comes from honest work, Mrs. Henderson, same as anyone else's." "Honest?" Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows climbed toward her hairline. "Is that what you call consorting with drunks and ruffians? Is that what you call—" "Ma'am," came a quiet voice from the back of the store, "I believe the lady said she pays as she goes." Everyone turned to see Dan Crawford emerging from behind the dry goods shelves, his hat in his hands, and his expression polite but unmistakably firm. Mrs. Henderson's face went red as a turkey's wattle. "Mr. Crawford, surely you're not defending, that is, surely you understand the standards we try to maintain in this establishment." Dan's smile was thin as winter ice. "I understand that Miss Macready has been coming to this store for 3 years and has never failed to pay her debts or caused any trouble. Seems to me that's the kind of customer any honest merchant would value." The store fell silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall and the soft whisper of Rose's surprised breathing. No one had stood up for her in longer than she could remember, and certainly no one as respected as Daniel Crawford. That evening, Dan Crawford did something that surprised even himself. After finishing his business in town, instead of heading straight back to his ranch, he found himself outside the Silver Dollar Saloon, listening to Rose's voice drifting through the batwing doors as she sang Barbara Allen to a crowd of miners who were too drunk to appreciate the beauty of her voice, but sober enough to demand their entertainment. Dan had never set foot in the Silver Dollar. Not because he was particularly religious, but because saloons reminded him too much of his father, who died drowning his sorrows in whiskey after Dan's mother passed. But tonight, hearing Rose sing that old ballad with a voice that could make angels weep, he found himself pushing through those doors and taking a seat at a corner table. Rose saw him immediately. It was impossible not to notice when someone like Daniel Crawford walked into a place like the Silver Dollar. Their eyes met across the smoky room, and something passed between them that was too complex to name, but too powerful to ignore. When she finished her song, Rose made her way through the crowd to his table, carrying herself with the kind of grace that made her evening dress look dignified instead of scandalous. "Mr. Crawford," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "this is unexpected. Miss Macready." Dan stood up like his mother had taught him, even though most of the men in the Silver Dollar wouldn't have bothered. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I heard your singing from outside and, well, it seemed wrong to let something that beautiful go unappreciated." Rose felt something flutter in her chest. Not the familiar wariness that came with male attention, but something softer and more dangerous. Hope. "That's very kind of you to say." She gestured to the empty chair across from him. "May I?" They talked for an hour, speaking carefully around the obvious topics but finding common ground in unexpected places. Dan told her about his ranch, about the challenges of running cattle in unpredictable weather. Rose spoke about her love of music, about the books she read in her spare time, about her dreams of maybe opening a small music school someday, somewhere far from Timber Ridge. "Why don't you?" Dan asked. "Leave, I mean, start that school." Rose's smile was sad as autumn rain. "Takes money to start over, Mr. Crawford, more money than I've been able to save, and even if I had it," she gestured around the saloon, "this follows you. Once people know what you've been, they never let you forget it." Dan leaned forward, his voice dropping low enough that only she could hear. "Miss Macready, if you don't mind me saying so, I think you've got more character in your little finger than most of the folks in this town have in their whole bodies. What you do for work doesn't define who you are." Before Rose could respond, the saloon doors burst open, and 3 of the town's most prominent citizens walked in. Banker Morrison, Mayor Phillips, and Reverend Caldwell. They'd clearly been drinking already, and their presence in the Silver Dollar could only mean trouble. "Well, well," Morrison called out, his words slurred, just enough to be dangerous. "Look what we have here, our esteemed rancher Daniel Crawford, consorting with the local entertainment." Dan's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "Gentlemen, just having a conversation." "A conversation?" Mayor Phillips laughed, the sound ugly in the suddenly quiet saloon. "Is that what we're calling it now? Danny boy, surely you know better than to be seen with her kind." Rose started to stand, clearly intending to remove herself from the situation before it escalated, but Dan's hand gently touched her wrist. "Sit down, Rose," he said quietly. Then, louder, "Gentlemen, I'd appreciate it if you'd keep a civil tongue when speaking about Miss Macready." Reverend Caldwell stepped forward, weaving slightly. "Daniel, son, I'm disappointed in you, a good Christian man like yourself, associating with a woman of questionable virtue. What would your dear mother think?" That was the wrong thing to say. Dan Crawford stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound like fingernails on slate. When he reached his full height, the three drunk men suddenly looked less confident in their righteousness. "Reverend," Dan said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made smart men step back and stupid men wish they had, "I think you'd better be very careful about what you say next." "Now, Daniel, there's no need for—" "My mother," Dan interrupted, "taught me to judge people by their actions, not their circumstances. She taught me to protect those who couldn't protect themselves and to stand up for what's right, even when it's not convenient." His eyes moved from one man to the next. "She also taught me that the most dangerous sin isn't the one everyone can see, but the one that hides behind respectability." He turned to look at Rose, who was staring at him with something like wonder in her green eyes. "Miss Macready," he said loud enough for the whole saloon to hear, "I'd be honored if you'd allow me to escort you to dinner tomorrow evening, somewhere proper, somewhere you deserve to be treated with the respect any decent woman should receive." The silence that followed was so complete you could hear dust settling on the bar. Every eye in the place was fixed on the rancher, who just asked the saloon girl out in front of God and half the territory. Rose looked at Dan Crawford, really looked at him, and saw something she'd stopped believing existed, a good man who was willing to stand up for what was right, regardless of the cost. "Mr. Crawford," she said, her voice steady as mountain stone, "I'd be delighted." The next evening, Dan Crawford walked into the Silver Dollar, wearing his best suit and carrying a bouquet of wild flowers he'd picked himself. He offered Rose his arm like she was the finest lady in the territory, and together they walked down Main Street to Henderson's restaurant, where he'd reserved the best table in the house. The reaction was everything you might expect, and more. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as they passed. Mrs. Patterson nearly dropped her shopping basket. Even the horses seemed to sense the drama, prancing nervously as their riders stared. At the restaurant, Henderson himself tried to refuse them service. "Mr. Crawford, surely you understand that we can't have, that is, this establishment caters to respectable families." Dan's response was quiet, but unmistakable. "Mr. Henderson, Miss Macready and I have a reservation. If you'd prefer not to honor it, I'll be happy to take my business, all of my business elsewhere, permanently." Henderson looked at Dan's face, calculated how much money the Crawford Ranch spent in his establishment each month, and showed them to their table with a smile that looked like it hurt. Over dinner, Dan and Rose talked about everything and nothing. She told him about her childhood in Missouri, about the husband who'd beaten her until she'd had to choose between staying and dying. He told her about his plans for expanding his herd, about the loneliness that came with running a ranch by yourself, about how his mother's death had left him wondering if he'd ever find someone to share his life with. "Dan," Rose said as they shared a piece of apple pie, "why are you doing this? You have to know what people are saying, what they'll keep saying." Dan set down his fork and looked at her with those coffee-dark eyes. "Rose, I've been alone for 5 years now. 5 years of eating supper by myself, of having no one to share good news with, of going to sleep every night in an empty house. You want to know why I'm doing this?" She nodded. "Because in the past year, watching you handle every cruel word and petty slight with grace, watching you be kind to folks who didn't deserve it, watching you work hard and never complain, I realized something. You're the finest woman I've ever met. And if the good people of Timber Ridge can't see that, then maybe they're not as good as they think they are." Rose felt tears stinging her eyes, the good kind, the kind that came when someone saw past your worst moments to your best possibilities. "Dan, your past brought you here," he said simply, "and here is where I found you. I'm not interested in who you had to be to survive. I'm interested in who you choose to be now." Long pause, letting the weight of the moment settle. 3 weeks later, Daniel Crawford did something that scandalized Timber Ridge from the church steps to the cemetery gates. He married Rose Macready in a ceremony performed by a traveling preacher, since Reverend Caldwell had refused to perform the service. The wedding was small, just Dan, Rose, the preacher, and old Charlie Hennessy as witness. Rose wore a simple blue dress she'd sewn herself, and Dan wore the same suit he'd worn to their first dinner. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Dan kissed his bride like she was the most precious thing in the territory. The transformation that followed wasn't immediate, but it was undeniable. As Mrs. Daniel Crawford, Rose found doors opening that had been slammed shut before. Not all doors and not all at once, but enough to matter. She started giving music lessons to the children of families brave enough to look past her history, and her beautiful voice became a welcome addition to church services once Reverend Caldwell was replaced by a younger, more compassionate minister. Dan had been right about his wife's character. Rose threw herself into ranch life with the same determination she'd once applied to surviving. She learned to tend sick cattle, to manage the household accounts, to cook for the seasonal hands. More importantly, she loved Dan Crawford with the fierce loyalty of a woman who'd never expected to be loved in return. They had 42 years together. Dan and Rose Crawford raised 4 children who learned from their mother that people should be judged by their hearts, not their histories. Built one of the most successful ranches in 3 counties, known as much for their hospitality as their cattle. When Rose passed at 73, her funeral was attended by nearly everyone in Timber Ridge, including many of the same people who'd once crossed the street to avoid her. Mrs. Patterson, now an elderly widow herself, was heard to say that Rose Crawford had been the finest woman she'd ever known, and wasn't it a shame it had taken her so long to recognize it. But the words that mattered most were spoken by Dan, standing beside her grave with their children and grandchildren around him. "She taught me that love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone worth fighting for, and then doing the fighting every single day." Final pause, like embers cooling in the firelight. Now, I've told you this story, not because it's the most exciting tale I know, though watching a whole town eat crow surely has its moments, but because it reminds us that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is see past what everyone else sees to what's really there. Sometimes the most respectable people are the ones who judge others without knowing their stories. Sometimes the fallen ones are the ones who've learned grace through suffering, and sometimes, just sometimes, when everyone else has given up on someone, that's exactly when they need one person to believe in them most. The frontier's full of stories about men who took what they wanted and women who had no choice in the matter. But this one's about a man who chose love over reputation, and a woman who proved that where you've been doesn't have to determine where you're going. Trust me on that. I've seen redemption wear a wedding dress, and it's a sight that'll restore your faith in the way people can change when someone gives them reason to.